So far, we've talked about sensation, and we've touched on, the sensory pathways and how sensation becomes perception, but now we're going to learn a little bit more about how we actually detect stimuli that are out in our environment. So, for example, how do we detect, how do we hear something? How do we feel something? How do we see something? How can we taste and smell things? The bottom line is there has to be enough of the stimulus present for it to cross what is called our absolute threshold. So if something falls below my threshold, it means that I'm not going to hear it. The sound might be there, but I'm not able to hear it. From person to person, we have thresholds that might vary. Take, for example, you're sitting, let's say, in the room with your parents, and let's just say, you can try this actually, you can put the TV down really, really low and slowly raise the volume, really slowly. Note the point at which each person in the room is first able to hear the sound. You might find that you are able to hear it before your parents, and this just means that you have a lower threshold. So less of the stimulus is needed in order for you to detect it, in order for you to sense it. So the weakest level, or the minimum amount of a stimulus that can be accurately detected 50% of the time, is our absolute threshold. We'll watch the Seinfeld clip together in class to demonstrate absolute threshold. These are measures of the absolute thresholds for all of the human senses of vision, hearing, taste, smell, and touch. So vision, a candle flame viewed from about 30 minutes on a clear, dark night, is likely to cross an individual's threshold 50% of the time. For hearing, a watch ticking from about 20 feet away in a quiet room will cross a human being's threshold for hearing 50% of the time. And you can take a look at some of these other examples. Subliminal messages, or anything that is subliminal, falls below our absolute threshold, meaning at least 50% of the time we would be unable to detect the stimulus. There's not enough of the stimulus present for us to be able to detect it 50% of the time. Recall our discussion of priming. Do you remember priming? Priming is a way where cues that are right in front of us can access the unconscious or automatic part of our cognitive processing and influence our behavior later on. You may have heard that, let's say, movie theaters are able to flash a word on the screen like buy popcorn. For a very brief period of time, it actually falls below your threshold, the idea that this can somehow influence your buying behavior. There's no controlled research that has ever shown that type of subliminal messaging can actually influence people's buying habits. However, there is such a thing called perception without awareness, which is when we might see something. In other words, it's there, we've detected it. We haven't on a conscious level thought much about it, yet it can actually influence our behavior later on. This is an example we can look at in class from the Bush campaign. The Bush campaign, when he was running in 2000 against Al Gore, they were accused of trying to use subliminal messaging in their advertising. Actually, we'll just take a quick look at it right now. Let's see if you can find the word rats.
Under Clinton Gore, prescription drug prices have skyrocketed and nothing's been done. George Bush has a plan. Add a prescription drug benefit to Medicare.
Every senior will have access to prescription drug benefits.
And Al Gore? Gore opposed bipartisan reform. He's pushing a big government plan that lets Washington bureaucrats interfere with what your doctors prescribe. The Gore prescription plan, bureaucrats decide.
Here's some examples of perception without awareness. So you can see the arrow and the FedEx sign. This individual riding, looking like they're riding a bicycle in the Tostitos branding or logo. You can see two people actually enjoying chips with a bowl of salsa. So these are examples of priming, or things that, examples of stimuli that might cross our threshold. We may not think a whole lot about it on a conscious level, but companies do this because they want to try to influence our buying behavior. So absolute threshold is the smallest amount of a stimulus that needs to be present in order for us to detect it 50% of the time. Difference threshold is the smallest amount that a stimulus can be changed and the difference be detected. And it's also known as just noticeable difference. So again, you can do that same thing with the TV, right? Except this time you can have the TV at a volume and then you can start slowly turning it up and see when the people in the room notice that the volume has changed. The second that you notice the change, it has crossed your difference threshold. If you're making a pot of soup and you go to taste it and you're like, oh, this isn't salty enough. You adding the salt and continually tasting it until you're able to tell that there's more salt in the soup, that has crossed your difference threshold, or just noticeable difference. There are things that fall below our difference threshold, like, for example, how much you grow in any given day. Those increases are so small and incremental that, like, you don't wake up in the morning and your parent goes, oh my gosh, you grew so much overnight, right? So this is an example of something, child's growth is an example of something that falls below just noticeable difference. You are going to try this actually on your own. I have directions for you in your notebook for how to do this. So why don't you pause the video and go ahead and do that. Now that we're back, so what did you notice? You may have noticed that the brighter your phone was, the more you had to change it in order for you to notice that the brightness was changing. Whereas when the brightness is very, very low, you only have to adjust it a little bit in order to notice that it's getting brighter. Weber's law explains this phenomenon. Weber's law explains just noticeable difference by basically saying that just noticeable difference is proportional to the intensity or the strength of the stimulus. So in other words, the louder the sound, the more it's got to change for us to notice the difference. The brighter the light, the more it's got to change for us to notice the difference. In terms of how much difference, in terms of how much a stimulus needs to change in order for us to notice the difference, there is a percentage that changes by depending on the sense. So for weight, for example, two objects must differ in weight by 5% in order for an individual to detect the change or to notice the difference. So again, just noticeable difference is large when the stimulus intensity is high, so when the music is loud. Just noticeable difference is small when the intensity is low or when the music is on a low volume.